Book 2, Chapter 16 of Hide and Seek by Wilkie Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. The Day of Reckoning. On the forenoon of the day that followed Matt's return to Kirk Street, the ordinarily dull aspect of Beargrove Square was enlivened by a procession of 3 handsome private carriages which stopped at Mr. Thorpe's door. From each carriage there descended gentlemen of highly respectable appearance, clothed in shining black garments, and wearing, for the most part, white cravats. One of these gentlemen carried in his hands a handsome silver inkstand, and another gentleman, who followed him, bore a roll of glossy paper, tied round with a broad ribbon of sober purple hue. The roll contained an address to Mr. Thorpe, eulogizing his character in very affectionate terms. The inkstand was a testimonial to be presented after the address, and the gentlemen who occupied the 3 private carriages were all eminent members of the religious society which Mr. Thorpe had served in the capacity of secretary, and from which he now was obliged to secede in consequence of the precarious state of his health. A small and orderly assembly of idle people had collected on the pavement to see the gentlemen alight, to watch them go into the house, to stare at the inkstand, to wonder at the address, to observe that Mr. Thorpe's page wore his best livery, and that Mr. Thorpe's housemaid had on new cap ribbons and her Sunday gown. After the street door had been closed and these various objects for popular admiration had disappeared, there still remained an attraction outside in the square which addressed itself to the general ear. One of the footmen in attendance on the carriages had collected many interesting particulars about the deputation and the testimonial, and while he related them in regular order to another footman anxious for information, the small and orderly public of idlers stood round about, and eagerly caught up any stray words explanatory of the ceremonies then in progress inside the house, which fell in their way. One of the most attentive of these listeners was a swarthy complexioned man with bristling whiskers and a scarred face, who had made one of the assembly on the pavement from the moment of its first congregating. He had been almost as much stared at by the people about him as the deputation itself, and had been set down among them generally as a foreigner of the most outlandish kind. But, in plain truth, he was English to the backbone, being no other than Matthew Grice. Matt's look, as he stood listening among his neighbours, was now just as quietly vigilant, his manner just as gruffly self-possessed as usual, but it had cost him a hard struggle that morning, in the solitude of one of his longest and loneliest walks, to compose himself, or, in his favourite phrase, to get to be his own man again. From the moment when he had thrown the lock of hair into the fire, to the moment when he was now loitering at Mr. Thorpe's door, he had never doubted, whatever others might have done, that the man who had been the ruin of his sister, and the man who was the nearest blood relation of the comrade who shared his roof and lay sick at that moment in his bed, were one and the same. Though he stood now amid the casual street spectators, apparently as indolently curious as the most careless among them, looking at what they looked at, listening to what they listened to, and leaving the square when they left it, he was resolved all the time to watch his first opportunity of entering Mr. Thorpe's house that very day, resolved to investigate through all its ramifications the secret which he had first discovered when the fragments of Zack's hair were playfully held up for him to look at in the deaf and dumb girl's hand. The dispersion of the idlers on the pavement was accelerated, and the footman's imaginary description of the proceedings then in progress at Mr. Thorpe's was cut short by the falling of a heavy shower. The frost, after breaking up, had been succeeded that year by prematurely mild spring weather. April seemed to have come a month before its time. Regardless of the rain, Matt walked slowly up and down the streets round Beargrove Square, peering every now and then from afar off through the misty shower to see if the carriages were still drawn up at Mr. Thorpe's door. The ceremony of presenting the testimonial was evidently a protracted one, for the vehicles were long kept waiting for their owners. The rain had passed away, the sun had reappeared, fresh clouds had gathered, and it was threatening a second shower before the deputation from the great religious society re-entered their vehicles and drove out of the square. When they had quitted it, Matt advanced and knocked at Mr. Thorpe's door. The clouds rolled up darkly over the sun, and the first warning drops of the new shower began to fall as the door opened. The servant hesitated about admitting him. He had anticipated that this sort of obstacle would be thrown in his way at the outset, and had provided against it in his own mind beforehand. "Tell your master," he said, "that his son is ill, and I've come to speak to him about it." This message was delivered and had the desired effect. Matt was admitted into the drawing-room immediately. The chairs occupied by the members of the deputation had not been moved away. The handsome silver inkstand was on the table. The address, beautifully written on the fairest white paper, lay by it. Mr. Thorpe stood before the fireplace, and bending over towards the table, mechanically examined for the second time the signatures attached to the address, while his strange visitor was being ushered upstairs. Matt's arrival had interrupted him just at the moment when he was going to Mrs. Thorpe's room to describe to her the presentation ceremony which she had not been well enough to attend. He had stopped immediately, and the faint smile that was on his face had vanished from it when the news of his son's illness reached him through the servant. But the hectic flush of triumph and pleasure which his interview with the deputation had called into his cheeks still coloured them as brightly as ever when Matthew Grice entered the room. "You have come, sir," Mr. Thorpe began, "to tell me—" He hesitated, stammered out another word or two, then stopped. Something in the expression of the dark and strange face that he saw lowering at him under the black velvet skull-cap suspended the words on his lips. In his present nervous, enfeebled state, any sudden emotions of doubt or surprise, no matter how slight and temporary in their nature, always proved too powerful for his self-control, and betrayed themselves in his speech and manner painfully. Matt said not a word to break the ominous silence. Was he at that moment in very truth standing face to face with Arthur Carr? Could this man, so frail and meagre, with the narrow chest, the drooping figure, the effeminate pink tinge on his wan, wrinkled cheeks, be indeed the man who had driven Mary to that last refuge where the brambles and weeds grew thick, and the foul mud-pools stagnated in the forgotten corner of the churchyard? "You have come, sir," resumed Mr. Thorpe, controlling himself by an effort which deepened the flush on his face, "to tell me news of my son which I am not entirely unprepared for. I heard from him yesterday, and, though it did not strike me at first, I noticed on referring to his letter afterwards that it was not in his own handwriting. My nerves are not very strong, and they have been tried, pleasurably, most pleasurably tried, already this morning by such testimonies of kindness and sympathy as it does not fall to the lot of many men to earn. May I beg you, if your news should be of an alarming nature, which God forbid, to communicate it as gently—" "My news is this," Matt broke in. "Your son's been hurt in the head, but he's got over the worst of it now. He lives with me, I like him, and I mean to take care of him till he gets on his legs again. That's my news about your son. But that's not all I've got to say. I bring you news of somebody else." "Will you take a seat and be good enough to explain yourself?" They sat down at opposite sides of the table, with the testimonial and the address lying between them. The shower outside was beginning to fall at its heaviest. The splashing noise of the rain and the sound of running footsteps as the few foot passengers in the square made for shelter at the top of their speed penetrated into the room during the pause of silence which ensued after they had taken their seats. Mr. Thorpe spoke first. "May I inquire your name?" he said, in his lowest and calmest tones. Matt did not seem to hear the question. He took up the address from the table, looked at this list of signatures, and turned to Mr. Thorpe. "I've been hearing about this," he said. "Are all them names there the names of friends of yours?" Mr. Thorpe looked a little astonished, but he answered, after a moment's hesitation, "Certainly, the most valued friends I have in the world." "Friends," pursued Matt, reading to himself the introductory sentence in the address, "who have put the most affectionate trust in you." Mr. Thorpe began to look rather offended as well as rather astonished. "Will you excuse me," he said coldly, "if I beg you to proceed to the business that has brought you here?" Matt placed the address on the table again, immediately in front of him, and took a pencil from a tray with writing materials in it, which stood near at hand. "Friends who have put the most affectionate trust in you," he repeated. "The name of one of them, friends, isn't here. It ought to be, and I mean to put it down." As the point of his pencil touched the paper of the address, Mr. Thorpe started from his chair. "What am I to understand, sir, by this conduct?" he began haughtily, stretching out his hand to possess himself of the address. Matt looked up with a serpent glitter in his eyes, and the angry red tinge glowing in the scars on his cheek. "Sit down," he said. "I'm not quick at writing. Sit down and wait till I'm done." Mr. Thorpe's face began to look a little agitated. He took a step towards the fireplace, intending to ring the bell. "Sit down and wait," Matt reiterated, in quick, fierce, quietly uttered tones of command, rising from his own chair, and pointing peremptorily to the seat just vacated by the master of the house. A sudden doubt crossed Mr. Thorpe's mind and made him pause before he touched the bell. Could this man be in his right senses? His actions were entirely unaccountable. His words and his way of uttering them were alike strange. His scarred, scowling face looked hardly human at that moment. Would it be well to summon help? No, worse than useless. Except the page, who was a mere boy, there were none but women servants in the house. When he remembered this, he sat down again, and at the same moment Matt began, clumsily and slowly, to write on the blank space beneath the last signature attached to the address. The sky was still darkening apace. The rain was falling heavily and more heavily as he traced the final letter, and then handed the paper to Mr. Thorpe, bearing inscribed on it the name of Mary Grice. "Read that name," said Matt. Mr. Thorpe looked at the characters traced by the pencil. His face changed instantly. He sank down into the chair. One faint cry burst from his lips. Then he was silent. Low, stifled, momentary as it was, that cry proclaimed him to be the man. He was self-denounced by it even before he cowered down, shuddering in the chair, with both his hands pressed convulsively over his face. Matt rose to his feet and spoke, eyeing him piteously from head to foot. "Not a friend of all of them," he said, pointing down at the address, "put such affectionate trust in you as she did. When first I see her grave in the strange churchyard, I said I'd be even with the man who laid her in it. I'm here today to be even with you. Carr or Thorpe, whichever you call yourself, I know how you used her from first to last. Her father was my father. Her name is my name. You were her worst enemy 23 years ago. You are my worst enemy now. I am her brother, Matthew Grice." The hands of the shuddering figure beneath him suddenly dropped. The ghastly uncovered face looked up at him, with such a panic stare in the eyes, such a fearful quivering and distortion of all the features, that it tried even his firmness of nerve to look at it steadily. In spite of himself, he went back to his chair and sat down doggedly by the table, and was silent. A low murmuring and moaning, amid which a few disconnected words made themselves faintly distinguishable, caused him to look round again. He saw that the ghastly face was once more hidden. He heard the disconnected words reiterated, always in the same stifled, wailing tones. Now and then a half-finished phrase was audible from behind the withered hands still clasped over the face. He heard such fragments of sentences as these: "Have pity on my wife. Accept the remorse of many years. Spare me the disgrace." After those 4 last words he listened for no more. The merciless spirit was roused in him again the moment he heard them. "Spare you the disgrace?" he repeated, starting to his feet. "Did you spare her? Not you." Once more the hands dropped. Once more the ghastly face slowly and horribly confronted him. but this time he never recoiled from it. There was no mercy in him, none in his looks, none in his tones, as he went on. "What? It would disgrace you, would it? Then disgraced you shall be. You've kept it secret, have you? You shall tell that secret to every soul that comes about the house. You shall own Mary's disgrace, Mary's death, and Mary's child before every man who's put his name down on that bit of paper. You shall, as soon as tomorrow, if I like. You shall, if I have to bring your child with me to make you. If I have to stand up, hand in hand along with her, here on your own hearthstone." He stopped. The cowering figure was struggling upward from the chair. One of the withered hands, slowly raised, was stretching itself out towards him. The panic-stricken eyes were growing less vacant, and were staring straight into his with a fearful meaning in their look. The pale lips were muttering rapidly. At first he could not tell what. Then he succeeded in catching the two words. "Mary's child," quickly, faintly, incessantly reiterated, until he spoke again. "Yes," he said, pitiless as ever. "Yes, Mary's child. Your child. Haven't you seen her? Is it that you're staring and trembling about? Go and look at her. She lives within gunshot of you. Ask Zack's friend, the painter man, to show you the deaf and dumb girl he picked up among the horse riders. Look here. Look at this bracelet. Do you remember your own hair in it? The hands that brought up Mary's child took that bracelet from Mary's pocket. Look at it again. Look at it as close as you like." Once more he stopped. The frail figure which had been feebly rising out of the chair while he held up the hair bracelet suddenly and heavily sank back in it. He saw the eyelids half close, and a great stillness pass over the face. He heard one deep-drawn breath, but no cry now, no moaning, no murmuring, no sound whatever except the steady splash of the fast-falling rain on the pavement outside. Dead? A thought of Zack welled up into his heart and troubled it. He hesitated for a moment, then bent over the chair and put his hand on the bosom of the deathly figure reclining in it. A faint fluttering was still to be felt, and the pulse, when he tried that next, was beating feebly. It was not death he looked on now, but the swoon that is near neighbour to it. For a minute or two he stood with his eyes fixed on the white, calm face beneath him, thinking. "If me and Zack," he whispered to himself, "hadn't been brothers together." He left the sentence unfinished, took his hat quickly and quitted the room. In the passage downstairs he met one of the female servants, who opened the street door for him. "Your master wants you," he said with an effort. He spoke those words, passed by her, and left the house. End of chapter 16. Book 2, Chapter 17 of Hide and Seek by Wilkie Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Matthew Grice's Revenge. Neither looking to the right nor the left, neither knowing nor caring whither he went, Matthew Grice took the first turning he came to, which led him out of Beargrove Square. It happened to be the street communicating with a long suburban road, at the remote extremity of which Mr. Blyth lived. Matt followed this road mechanically, not casting a glance at the painter's abode when he passed it, and taking no notice of a cab with luggage on the roof, which drew up as he walked by at the garden gate. If he had only looked round at the vehicle for a moment, he must have seen Valentine sitting inside it and counting out the money for his fare. But he still went on, straight on, looking aside at nothing. He fronted the wind and the clearing quarter of the sky as he walked. The shower was now fast subsiding, and the first rays of returning sunlight as they streamed through mist and cloud fell tenderly and warmly on his face. Though he did not show it outwardly, there was strife and trouble within him. The name of Zack was often on his lips, and he varied constantly in his rate of walking. now quickening, now slackening his pace at irregular intervals. It was evening before he turned back towards home, night before he sat down again in the chair by young Thorpe's bedside. "I'm a deal better to-night, Matt," said Zack, answering his first inquiries. "That good fellow Blythe has come back. He's been sitting here with me a couple of hours or more. Where have you been to all day, you restless old rough and tough?" he continued, with something of his natural light-hearted manner returning already. "There's a letter come for you, by the by. The landlady said she would put it on the table in the front room." Matthew found and opened the letter, which proved to contain 2 enclosures. One was addressed to Mr. Blythe, the other had no direction. The handwriting in the letter being strange to him, Matt looked first for the name at the end, and found that it was Thorpe. "Wait a bit," he said, as Zack spoke again just then. "I want to read my letter. We'll talk after." This is what he read. "Some hours have passed since you left my house. I have had time to collect a little strength and composure, and have received such assistance and advice as have enabled me to profit by that time. Now I know that I can write calmly, I send you this letter. My object is not to ask how you became possessed of the guilty secret which I had kept from everyone, even from my wife, but to offer you such explanation and confession as you have a right to demand from me. I do not cavil about that right. I admit that you possess it, without desiring further proof than your actions, your merciless words, and the bracelet in your possession have afforded me. It is fit you should first be told that the assumed name by which I was known at Dibbleden merely originated in a foolish jest, in a wager that certain companions of my own age, who were accustomed to ridicule my fondness for botanical pursuits, and often to follow and disturb me when I went in search of botanical specimens, would not be able to trace and discover me in my country retreat. I went to Dibbleden because the neighbourhood was famous for specimens of rare ferns which I desired to possess, and I took my assumed name before I went to help in keeping me from being traced and disturbed by my companions. My father alone was in the secret, and came to see me once or twice in my retirement. I have no excuse to offer for continuing to preserve my false name at a time when I was bound to be candid about myself and my station in life. My conduct was as unpardonably criminal in this as it was in greater things. My stay at the cottage I had taken lasted much longer than my father would have remitted, if I had not deceived him, and if he had not been much harassed at that time by unforeseen difficulties in his business as a foreign merchant. These difficulties arrived at last at a climax, and his health broke down under them. His presence, or the presence of a properly qualified person to represent him, was absolutely required in Germany, where one of his business houses, conducted by an agent, was established. I was his only son. He had taken me as a partner into his London house, and had allowed me, on the plea of delicate health, to absent myself from my duties for months and months together, and to follow my favourite botanical pursuits just as I pleased. When, therefore, he wrote me word that great part of his property, and great part, consequently, of my sister's fortunes, depended on my going to Germany, his own health not permitting him to take the journey, I had no choice but to place myself at his disposal immediately. I went away, being assured beforehand that my absence would not last more than 3 or 4 months at the most. While I was abroad, I wrote to your sister constantly. I had treated her dishonourably and wickedly, but no thought of abandoning her had ever entered my heart. My dearest hope at that time was the hope of seeing her again. Not one of my letters was answered. I was detained in Germany beyond the time during which I had consented to remain there, and in the excess of my anxiety I even ventured to write twice to your father. Those letters also remained unanswered. When I at last got back to England, I immediately sent a person on whom I could rely to Dibbleden to make the inquiries which I dreaded to make myself. My messenger was turned from your doors with the fearful news of your sister's flight from home and of her death. It was then I first suspected that my letters had been tampered with. It was then, too, when the violence of my grief and despair had a little abated, that the news of your sister's flight inspired me for the first time with a suspicion of the consequence which had followed the commission of my sin. You may think it strange that this suspicion should not have occurred to me before. It would seem so no longer, perhaps, if I detailed to you the peculiar system of home education by which my father, strictly and conscientiously, endeavoured to preserve me, as other young men are not usually preserved, from the moral contaminations of the world. But it would be useless to dwell on this now. No explanations can alter the events of the guilty and miserable past. Anxiously, though privately and in fear and trembling, I caused such enquiries to be made as I hoped might decide the question whether the child existed or not. They were long persevered in, but they were useless. Useless, perhaps, as I now think with bitter sorrow, because I trusted them to others and had not the courage to make them openly myself. 2 years after that time I married, under circumstances not of an ordinary kind. What circumstances you have no claim to know. That part of my life is my secret and my wife's, and belongs to us alone. I have now dwelt long enough for your information on my own guilty share in the events of the past. As to the present and the future, I have still a word or two left to say. You have declared that I shall expiate, by the exposure of my shameful secret before all my friends, the wrong your sister suffered at my hands. My life has been one long expiation for that wrong. My broken health, my altered character, my weary secret sorrows, unpartaken and unconsoled, have punished me for many years past more heavily than you think. Do you desire to see me visited by more poignant sufferings than these? If it be so, you may enjoy the vindictive triumph of having already inflicted them. Your threats will force me, in a few hours, from the friends I have lived with, at the very time when the affection shown to me, and the honour conferred on me by those friends, have made their society most precious to my heart. You force me from this, and from more, for you force me from my home at the moment when my son has affectionately entreated me to take him back to my fireside. These trials, heavy as they are, I am ready to endure if, by accepting them humbly, I may be deemed to have made some atonement for my sin. But more I have not the fortitude to meet. I cannot face the exposure with which you are resolved to overwhelm me. The anxiety, perhaps I ought to say the weakness, of my life has been to win and keep the respect of others. You are about, by disclosing the crime which dishonoured my youth, to deprive me of my good fame. I can let it go without a struggle, as part of the punishment that I have deserved, but I have not the courage to wait and see you take it from me. My own sensations tell me that I have not long to live. My own convictions assure me that I cannot fitly prepare myself for death until I am far removed from worldly interests and worldly terrors, in a word, from the horror of an exposure which I have deserved, but which, at the end of my weary life, is more than I can endure. We have seen the last of each other in this world. Tonight I shall be beyond the reach of your retaliation, for tonight I shall be journeying to the retreat in which the short remainder of my life will be hidden from you and from all men. It now only remains for me to advert to the 2 enclosures contained in this letter. The first is addressed to Mr. Blyth. I leave it to reach his hands through you, because I am ashamed to communicate with him directly as from myself. If what you said about my child be the truth, and I cannot dispute it, then, in my ignorance of her identity, in my estrangement from the house of her protector since she first entered it, I have unconsciously committed such an offence against Mr. Blyth as no contrition can ever adequately atone for. Now, indeed, I feel how presumptuously merciless my bitter conviction of the turpitude of my own sin has made me towards what I deemed like sins in others. Now also I know that, unless you have spoken falsely, I have been guilty of casting the shame of my own deserted child in the teeth of the very man who had nobly and tenderly given her an asylum in his own home. The unutterable anguish which only the bare suspicion of this has inflicted on me might well have been my death. I marvel even now at my own recovery from it. You are free to look at the letter to Mr. Blyth which I now entrust to you. Besides the expression of my shame, my sorrow, and my sincere repentance, it contains some questions, to which Mr. Blyth, in his Christian kindness, will, I doubt not, readily write answers. The questions only refer to the matter of the child's identity, and the address I have written down at the end is that of the house of business of my lawyer and agent in London. He will forward the document to me, and will then arrange with Mr. Blyth the manner in which a fit provision for my property may be best secured to his adopted child. He has deserved her love, and to him I gratefully and humbly leave her. For myself, I am not worthy even to look upon her face. The second enclosure is meant for my son, and is to be delivered in the event of your having already disclosed to him the secret of his father's guilt. But if you have not done this, if any mercy towards me has entered into your heart, and pleads with it for pardon and for silence, then destroy the letter, and tell him that he will find a communication waiting for him at the house of my agent. He wrote to ask my pardon. He has it freely. Freely in my turn I hope to have his forgiveness for severities exercised towards him, which were honestly meant to preserve him betimes from ever falling as his father fell, but which I now fear were persevered in too hardly and too long. I have suffered for this error, as for others, heavily, more heavily when he abandoned his home than I should ever wish him to know. You said he lived with you and that you were fond of him. Be gentle with him, now that he's ill, for his mother's sake. My hand grows weaker and weaker. I can write no more. Let me close this letter by entreating your pardon. If you ever grant it me, then I also ask your prayers. With this, the letter ended. Matthew sat holding it open in his hand for a little while. He looked round once or twice at the enclosed letter from Mr. Thorpe to his son, which lay close by on the table, but did not destroy it, did not so much as touch it even. Zack spoke to him before long from the inner room. "I'm sure you must have done reading your letter by this time, Matt. I've been thinking, old fellow, of the talk we used to have, about going back to America together, and trying a little buffalo hunting, and roaming about in the wilds. If my father takes me into favour again, and can be got to say yes, I should so like to go with you, Matt. Not for too long, you know, because of my mother and my friends over here, but a sea voyage and a little scouring about in what you call the lonesome places would do me such good. I don't feel as if I should ever settle properly to anything till I've had my fling. I wonder whether my father would let me go." "I know he would, Zack." "You? How?" "I'll tell you how another time. You shall have your run, Zack. You shall have your heart's content along with me." As he said this, he looked again at Mr. Thorpe's letter to his son, and took it up in his hand this time. "Oh, how I wish I was strong enough to start. Come in here, Matt, and let's talk about it." "Wait a bit, and I will." Pronouncing those words, he rose from his chair. "For your sake, Zack," he said, and dropped the letter into the fire. "What can you be about all this time?" asked young Thorpe. "Do you call to mind," said Matt, going into the bedroom and sitting down by the lad's pillow, "do you call to mind me saying that I'd be brothers with you when first us two come together? Well, Zack, I've only been trying to be as good as my word." "Trying? What do you mean? I don't understand, old fellow." "Never mind. You'll make it out better some day. Let's talk about getting aboard ship and going a buffalo hunting now." They discussed the projected expedition until Zack grew sleepy. As he fell off into a pleasant doze, Matt went back into the front room, and, taking from the table Mr. Thorpe's letter to Mr. Blyth, left Kirk Street immediately for the painter's house. It had occurred to Valentine to unlock his bureau twice since his return from the country, but on neither occasion had he found it necessary to open that long, narrow drawer at the back, in which he had secreted the hair bracelet years ago. He was consequently still totally ignorant that it had been taken away from him, when Matthew Grice entered the painting room and quietly put it into his hand. Consternation and amazement so thoroughly overpowered him that he suffered his visitor to lock the door against all intruders, and then to lead him peremptorily to a chair without uttering a single word of inquiry or expostulation. All through the narrative on which Matt now entered, he sat totally speechless, until Mr. Thorpe's letter was placed in his hands, and he was informed that Madonna was still to be left entirely under his own care. Then, for the first time, his cheeks showed symptoms of returning to their natural colour, and he exclaimed fervently, "Thank God! I shan't lose her after all. I only wish you had begun by telling me of that the moment you came into the room." Saying this, he began to read Mr. Thorpe's letter. When he had finished it and looked up at Matt, the tears were in his eyes. "I can't help it," said the simple-hearted painter. "It would even affect you, Mr. Grice, to be addressed in such terms of humiliation as these. How can he doubt my forgiving him, when he has a right to my everlasting gratitude for not asking me to part with our darling child? They never met. He has never, never seen her face," continued Valentine, in lower and fainter tones. "She always wore her veil down, by my wish, when we went out, and our walks were generally into the country instead of town way. I only once remember seeing him coming towards us, and then I crossed the road with her, knowing we were not on terms. There's something shocking in father and daughter living so near each other, yet being, if one may say so far, so very far apart. It is dreadful to think of that. It is far more dreadful to think of its having been her hand which held up the hair for you to look at, and her little innocent action which led to the discovery of who her father really was." "Do you ever mean to let her know as much about it as we do?" asked Matthew. The look of dismay began to appear again in Valentine's face. "Have you told Zack yet?" he inquired, nervously and eagerly. "No," said Matt. "And don't you. When Zack's on his legs again, he's going to take a voyage and get a season's hunting along with me in the wild country over the water. I'm as fond of the lad as if he was a bit of my own flesh and blood. I cottoned to him when he hit out so hearty for me at the singing shop, and we've been brothers together ever since. You mightn't think it, to look at me, but I've spared Zack's father for Zack's sake. And I don't ask no more reward for it than to take the lad a-hunting for a season or two along with me. When he comes back home again and we say good-bye, I'll tell him all what's happened, but I won't risk bringing so much as a cross look into his eyes now by dropping a word to him of what's passed betwixt his father and me." Although this speech excited no little surprise and interest in Valentine's mind, it did not succeed in suspending the anxieties which had been awakened in him by Matthew's preceding question, and which he now began to feel the necessity of confiding to Mrs. Blyth, his grand counsellor in all difficulties, and unfailing comforter in all troubles. "Do you mind waiting here," he said, "while I go upstairs and break the news to my wife? Without her advice I don't know what to do about communicating our discovery to the poor dear child. Do you mind waiting?" No, Matthew would willingly wait. Hearing this, Mr. Blyth left the room directly. He remained away a long time. When he came back, his face did not seem to have gained in composure during his absence. "My wife has told me of another discovery," he said, "which her motherly love for our adopted daughter enabled her to make some time since. I have been sadly surprised and distressed at hearing of it. But I need say no more on the subject to you than that Mrs. Blyth has at once decided me to confide nothing to Madonna, to Mary I ought to say, until Zack has got well again and has left England. When I heard just now from you of his projected voyage, I must confess I saw many objections to it. They have all been removed by what my wife has told me. I heartily agree with her that the best thing Zack can do is to make the trip he proposes. You are willing to take care of him, and I honestly believe that we may safely trust him with you." A serious difficulty being thus disposed of, Valentine found leisure to pay some attention to minor things. Among other questions which he now asked was one relating to the hair bracelet and to the manner in which Matthew had become possessed of it. He was answered by the frankest confession, a confession which tried even his kindly and forbearing disposition to the utmost as he listened to it, and which drew from him, when it was ended, some of the strongest terms of reproach that had ever passed his lips. Matt listened till he had done, then, taking his hat to go, muttered a few words of rough apology, which Valentine's good nature induced him to accept, almost as soon as they were spoken. "We must let bygones be bygones," said the painter. "You have been candid with me at last, at any rate, and in recognition of that candour I say, good night, Mr. Grice, as a friend of yours still." When Matt returned to Kirk Street, the landlady came out of her little parlour to tell him of a visitor who had been to the lodgings in his absence. An elderly lady, looking very pale and ill, had asked to see young Mr. Thorpe, and had prefaced the request by saying that she was his mother. Zack was then asleep, but the lady had been taken upstairs to see him in bed, had stooped over him and kissed him, and had then gone away again, hastily and in tears. Matthew's face grew grave as he listened, but he said nothing when the little lady had done, except a word or two charging her not to mention to Zack what had happened when he woke. It was plain that Mrs. Thorpe had been told her husband's secret, and that she had lovingly devoted herself to him as comforter and companion to the last. When the doctor paid his regular visit to the invalid the next morning, he was called on immediately for an answer to the important question of when Zack would be fit to travel. After due consideration and careful inspection of the injured side of the patient's head, he replied that in a month's time the lad might safely go on board ship, and that the sea voyage proposed would do more towards restoring him to perfect health and strength than all the tonic medicines that all the doctors in England could prescribe. Matthew might have found the month's inaction to which he was now obliged to submit for Zack's sake rather tedious, but for the opportune arrival in Kirk Street of a professional visitor from Dibbledene. Though his client had ungratefully and entirely forgotten him, Mr. Ted had not by any means forgotten his client, but had, on the contrary, attended to his interests with unremitting resolution and assiduity. He had discovered that Matt was entitled, under his father's will, to no less a sum than £2,000, if his identity could be properly established. To effect this result was now, therefore, the grand object of Mr. Ted's ambition. He had the prospect not only of making a little money, but of establishing a reputation in Dibbledene if he succeeded, and, by dint of perseverance, he ultimately did succeed. He carried Matt about to all sorts of places, insisted on his signing all sorts of papers and making all sorts of declarations, and ended by accumulating such a mass of evidence before the month was out, that Mr. Norby, as executor to the late Joshua Grice, declared himself convinced of the claimant's identity. On being informed of this result, Matt ordered the lawyer, after first deducting the amount of his bill from the forthcoming legacy, to draw him out such a legal form as might enable him to settle his property forthwith on another person. When Mr. Ted asked to be furnished with the name of this person, he was told to write Martha Peckover. "Mary's child has got you to look after her, and money enough from her father to keep her," said Matt, as he put the signed instrument into Valentine's hands. "When Martha Peckover's old and past her work, she may want a banknote or two to fall back on. Give her this when I'm gone, and say she earned it from Mary's brother the day she stopped and suckled Mary's child by the roadside." The day of departure drew near. Zack rallied so rapidly that he was able, a week before it arrived, to go himself and fetch the letter from his father which was waiting for him at the agent's office. It assured him, briefly but very kindly, of the forgiveness which he had written to ask, referred him to the man of business for particulars of the allowance granted to him, while he pursued his studies in the art, or otherwise occupied himself, urged him always to look on Mr. Blyth as the best friend and counsellor that he could ever have, and ended by engaging him to write often about himself and his employments to his mother, sending his letters to be forwarded through the agent. When Zack, hearing from this gentleman that his father had left the house in Beargrove Square, desired to know what had occasioned the change of residence, he was only informed that the state of Mr. Thorpe's health had obliged him to seek perfect retirement and repose, and that there were reasons at present for not mentioning the place of his retreat to any one, which it was not deemed expedient for his son to become acquainted with. The day of departure arrived. In the morning, by Valentine's advice, Zack wrote to his mother, only telling her in reference to his proposed trip that he was about to travel to improve and amuse himself in the company of a friend of whom Mr. Blyth approved. While he was thus engaged, the painter had a private interview with Matthew Grice, and very earnestly charged him to remember his responsibilities towards his young companion. Matt answered briefly and characteristically. "I told you I was as fond of him as if he was a bit of my own flesh and blood. If you don't believe I shall take care of him after that, I can't say nothing to make you." Both the travellers were taken up into Mrs. Blythe's room to say farewell. It was a sad parting. Zack's spirits had not been so good as usual since the day of his visit to the agents, and the other persons assembled were all more or less affected in an unusual degree by the approaching separation. Madonna had looked ill and anxious, though she would not own to having anything the matter with her, for some days past. But now, when she saw the parting looks exchanged around her, the poor girl's agitation got beyond her control, and became so painfully evident that Zack wisely and considerately hurried over the farewell scene. He went out first. Matthew followed him to the landing, then stopped and suddenly retraced his steps. He entered the room again, and took his sister's child by the hand once more, bent over her as she stood pale and in tears before him, and kissed her on the cheek. "Tell her some day that me and her mother was playmates together," he said to Mrs. Blythe as he turned away to join Zack on the stairs. Valentine accompanied them to the ship. When they shook hands together, he said to Matthew, "Zack has engaged to come back in a year's time. Shall we see you again with him?" Matt took the painter aside without directly answering him. "If ever you go to Banbury," he whispered, "look into the churchyard, in the dark corner amongst the trees. There's a bit of walnut wood planking put up now at the place where she is buried, and it would be a comfort to me to know that it was kept clean and neat. I should take it kind of you if you'd give it a brush or two with your hand when you're near it, for I never hope to see the place myself, no more." Sadly and thoughtfully, Valentine returned alone to his own house. He went up at once to his wife's room. As he opened the door, he started and stopped on the threshold. Madonna was sitting on the couch by her adopted mother, with her face hidden on Mrs. Blythe's bosom, and her arms clasped tight round Mrs. Blythe's neck. "Have you ventured to tell her all, Levy?" he asked. Mrs. Blythe was not able to speak in answer. She looked at him with tearful eyes, and bowed her head. Valentine lingered at the door for a moment, then softly closed it, and left them together. End of chapter 17. End of book 2. Closing chapter of Hide and Seek by Wilkie Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. A year and a half afterwards. It is sunset after a fine day in August, and Mr. Blythe is enjoying the evening breeze in the invalid room. Besides the painter and his wife, and Madonna, 2 visitors are present who occupy both the spare beds in the house. One is Mrs. Thorpe, the other Mrs. Peckover, and they have been asked to become Valentine's guests, to assist at the joyful ceremony of welcoming Zack to England on his return from the wilds of America. He has outstayed his year's leave of absence by nearly 6 months, and his appearance at Mr. Blythe's has become an event of daily, or more properly, of hourly expectation. There is a sad and significant change in Mrs. Thorpe's dress. She wears the widow's cap and weeds. It is nearly 7 months since her husband died in the remote Welsh village to which he retired on leaving London. With him, as with many other confirmed invalids, nature drooped to her final decay gradually and warily, but his death was painless, and his mental powers remained unimpaired to the end. One of the last names that lingered lovingly on his lips, after he had bade his wife farewell, was the name of his absent son. Mrs. Thorpe sits close to Mrs. Blyth, and talks to her in low, gentle tones. The kind black eyes of the painter's wife are brighter than they have been for many a long year past, and the clear tones of her voice, cheerful always, have a joyous sound in them now. Ever since the first days of the spring season, she has been gaining so greatly in health and strength that the favourable turn has taken place in her malady which was spoken of as possible by the doctors long ago as the time of first sufferings. She has several times for the last fortnight been moved from her couch for a few hours to a comfortable seat near the window, and if the fine weather still continues she is to be taken out, in a day or two, for an airing in an invalid chair. The prospect of this happy event, and the pleasant expectation of Zack's return, have made Valentine more gaily talkative and more nimbly restless than ever. As he skips discursively about the room at this moment, talking of all sorts of subjects and managing to mix art up with every one of them, dressed in the old jaunty frock-coat with the short tails, he looks, if possible, younger, plumper, rosier and brisker than when he was first introduced to the reader. It is wonderful, when people are really youthful at heart, to see how easily the girdle of Venus fits them, and how long they contrive to keep it on, without ever wearing it out. Mrs. Peckover, arrived in festively flaring cap ribbons, sits close to the window to get all the air she can, and tries to make more of it by fanning herself with the invariable red cotton pocket-handkerchief to which she has been all her life attached. In bodily circumference she has not lost an inch of rotundity, suffers in consequence considerably from the heat, and talks to Mr. Blyth with parenthetical pantings which reflect little credit on the cooling influence of the breeze, or the ventilating properties of the pocket-handkerchief fan. Madonna sits opposite to her at the window, as cool and pretty a contrast as can be imagined, in her white muslin dress and light rose-coloured ribbons. She is looking at Mrs. Peckover, and smiling every now and then at the comically languishing faces made by that excellent woman to express to little Mary the extremity of her sufferings from the heat. The whole length of the window-sill is occupied by an aeolian harp, one of the many presents which Valentine's portrait-painting expeditions have enabled him to offer to his wife. Madonna's hand is resting lightly on the box of the harp, for by touching it in this way she becomes sensible to the influence of its louder and higher notes when the rising breeze draws them out. This is the only pleasure she can derive from music, and it is always, during the summer and autumn evenings, one of the amusements that she enjoys in Mrs. Blyth's room. Mrs. Thorpe, in the course of her conversation with Mrs. Blyth, has been reminded of a letter to one of her sisters, which she has not yet completed, and goes to her own room to finish it. Valentine running to open the door for her, with the nimblest juvenile gallantry, then returning to the window and addressing Mrs. Peckover. "Hot as ever, eh? Shall I get you one of Levy's fans?" says Mr. Blyth. "No, thank you, sir. I ain't quite melted yet," answers Mrs. Peckover. "But I'll tell you what I wish you would do for me. I wish you would read me Master Zack's last letter. You promised, you know, sir." "And I would have performed my promise before, Mrs. Peckover, if Mrs. Thorpe had not been in the room. There are passages in the letter which it might revive very painful remembrances in her to hear. Now she has left us, I have not the least objection to read, if you are ready to listen." Saying this, Valentine takes the letter from his pocket. Madonna, recognizing it, asks by a sign if she may look over his shoulder and read it for the second time. The request is granted immediately. Mr. Blyth makes her sit on his knee, puts his arm round her waist, and begins to read aloud as follows. "My dear Valentine, although I am writing to you to announce my return, I cannot say that I take up my pen in good spirits. It is not so long since I picked up my last letters from England that told me of my father's death. But besides that, I have had a heavy trial to bear in hearing the dreadful secret which you all kept from me when it was discovered, and afterwards in parting from Matthew Grice. What I felt when I knew the secret, and heard why Matt and all of you had kept it from me, I may be able to tell you, but I cannot and dare not write about it. You may be interested to hear how my parting with Matthew happened, and I will relate it to you as well as I can. You know, from my other letters, all the glorious hunting and riding we have had, and the thousands of miles of country we've been over, and the wonderful places we've seen. Well, Bea, the place I now write from, has been the end of our travels. It was here I told Matt of my father's death, and he directly agreed with me that it was my duty to go home and comfort my poor dear mother by the first ship that sailed for England. After we'd settled that, he said he had something serious to tell me, and asked me to go with him northward, half a day's march along the sea-coast, saying we could talk together quietly as we went along. I saw that he'd got his rifle over his shoulder and his baggage at his back, and thought it odd, but he stopped me from asking any questions by telling me from beginning to end all that you and he knew about my father before we left England. I was at first so shocked and amazed by what I heard, and then had so much to say to him about it, that our half-day's march, by the time we'd got to the end of it, seemed to me to have hardly lasted as long as an hour. He stopped, though, at the place he had fixed on, and held out his hand to me, and said these words: "I've done my duty by you, Zack, as brother should by brother. The time's come at last for us two to say good-bye. You're going back over the sea to your friends, and I'm going inland by myself on the tramp." I had heard him talk of our parting in this way before, but had never thought it would really take place, and I tried hard, as you may imagine, to make him change his mind and sail for England with me. But it was useless. "No, Zack," he said, "I doubt if I'm fit for the life you're going back to lead. I've given it a trial, and a hard and bitter one it's been to me. I began life on the tramp, and on the tramp I shall end it. Good-bye, Zack. I shall think of you when I light my fire and cook my bit of victuals without you in the lonesome places tonight." I tried to control myself, Valentine, but my eyes got dim, and I caught fast hold of him by the arm. "Matt," I said, "I can't part with you in this dreary, hopeless way. Don't shut the future up from both of us for ever. We've been 18 months together. Let another year and a half pass, if you like, and then give yourself, and give me, another chance. Say you'll meet me, when that time is past, in New York. Or say at least you'll let me hear where you are." His face worked and quivered, and he only shook his head. "Come, Matt," I said, as cheerfully as I could. "If I'm ready to cross the sea again for your sake, you can't refuse to do what I ask you for mine." "Will it make the parting easier to you, my lad?" he asked kindly. "Yes, indeed it will," I answered. "Well then, Zack," he said, "you shall have your way. Don't let's say no more now. Come, let's cut it as short as we can, or we shan't part as men should. God bless you, lad, and all of them you're going back to see." Those were his last words. After he had walked a few yards inland, he turned round and waved his hand, then went on, and never turned again. I sat down on the sand hillock where we'd said good-bye, and burst out crying. What with the dreadful secret he'd been telling me as we came along, and then the parting when I didn't expect it, all I had of the man about me gave way somehow in a moment. And I sat alone, crying and sobbing on the sand hillock, with the surf roaring miles out at sea behind me, and the great plain before, with Matthew walking over it alone on his way to the mountains beyond. When I'd had time to get ashamed of myself for crying, and had got my eyesight clear again, he was already far away from me. I ran to the top of the highest hillock, and watched him over the plain. A desert without a shrub to break the miles and miles of flat ground spreading away to the mountains. I watched him as he got smaller and smaller. I watched till he got a mere black speck, till I was doubtful whether I still saw him or not, till I was certain at last that the great vacancy of the plain had swallowed him up from sight. My heart was very heavy, Valentine, as I went back to the town by myself. It is sometimes heavy still, for though I think much of my mother and of my sister, whom you've been so kind a father to, and whose affection it is such a new happiness to me to have the prospect of soon returning. I think occasionally of dear old Matt, too, and have my melancholy moments when I remember that he and I are not going back together. I hope you will think me improved by my long trip. I mean in behaviour as well as health. I have seen much and learned much and thought much, and I hope I have really profited and altered for the better during my absence. It is such a pleasure to think I am really going home. Here Mr. Blyth stops abruptly and closes the letter, for Mrs. Thorpe re-enters the room. "The rest is only about when he expects to be back," whispers Valentine to Mrs. Peckover. "By my calculations," he continues, raising his voice and turning towards Mrs. Thorpe, "by my calculations, which, not having a mathematical head, I don't boast of, mind, as being infallibly correct, Zack is likely, I should say, to be here in about—" "Hush! Hush! Hush!" cries Mrs. Peckover, jumping up with incredible agility at the window and clapping her hands in a violent state of excitement. "Don't talk about when he will be here. Here he is. He's come in a cab. He's got out into the garden. He sees me. Welcome back, Master Zack. Welcome back. Hooray! Hooray!" Here Mrs. Peckover forgets her company manners and waves the red cotton handkerchief out of the window in an irrepressible burst of triumph. Zack's hearty laugh is heard outside, then his quick step on the stairs, then the door opens and he comes in with his beaming sunburnt face healthier and heartier than ever. His first embrace is for his mother, his second for Madonna, and, after he has greeted everyone else cordially, he goes back to those two, and Mr. Blyth is glad to see that he sits down between them and takes their hands gently and affectionately in his. Matthew Grice is in all their memories when the first greetings are over. Valentine and Madonna look at each other, and the girl's fingers sign hesitatingly the letters of Matthew's name. "She is thinking of the comrade you have lost," says the painter, addressing himself a little sadly to Zack. "The only living soul that's kin to her now by her mother's side," adds Mrs. Peckover. "It's like her pretty ways to be thinking of him kindly for her mother's sake." "Are you really determined, Zack, to take that second voyage?" asks Valentine. "Are you determined to go back to America on the one faint chance of seeing Matt once more?" "If I am a living man 18 months hence," Zack answers resolutely, "nothing shall prevent my taking the voyage. Matthew Grice loved me like a brother, and, like a brother, I will yet bring him back, if he lives to keep his promise and meet me when the time comes." The time came, and on either side the two comrades of former days, in years so far apart, in sympathies so close together, lived to look each other in the face again. The solitude which had once hardened Matthew Grice had wrought on him in his riper age to better and higher ends. In all his later roamings, the tie which had bound him to those sacred human interests in which we live and move and have our being, the tie which he himself believed that he had broken, held fast to him still. His grim, scarred face softened, his heavy hand trembled in the friendly grasp that held it, as Zack pleaded with him once more, and this time pleaded not in vain. "I've never been my own man again," said Matt, "since you and me wished each other good-bye on the sandhills. The lonesome places have got strange to me, and my rifle's heavier in hand than ever I knew it before. There's some part of myself that seems left behind like, between Mary's grave and Mary's child. Must I cross the seas again to find it? Give us hold of your hand, Zack, and take the leavings of me back along with you." So the noble nature of the man unconsciously asserted itself in his simple words. So the two returned to the old land together. The first kiss with which his dead sister's child welcomed him back cooled the tramp's fever for ever, and the man of many wanderings rested at last among the friends who loved him, to wander no more. End of Hide and Seek by Wilkie Collins. Recording by Anna Simon.